Let's say your internet starts acting weird. Someone tells you, just reboot the router. And somehow, that actually works. But why? In reality, a home router is a small computer that's constantly managing connections between all your devices and the internet. To understand that, we first need to look at what your router is actually doing behind the scenes, starting with the NAT table. Most home networks have dozens of devices, but your ISP usually only gives you one public IP address. Network Address Translation, or NAT, is the mechanism your router uses to let all those devices share one address. Every device in your home network has a private IP address. When a device sends traffic to the internet, the router translates that internal address to the router's public IP. The router keeps track of which internal device started the connection so it knows where to send the response. This is where the NAT table comes in. The router maintains something called a NAT table, which is essentially a list of active connections. Each entry records information like the internal device's IP address, the port being used, and the external destination. The router rewrites the packet so it appears to come from the router's public IP address, and it stores that mapping in the NAT table, so it can reverse the process when a response comes back. So why can this table become a problem? Home routers often have limited RAM, limited CPU, and limited NAT table size. Modern households generate huge numbers of connections: streaming devices, phones, smart TVs, game consoles, cloud backups, and all kinds of IoT devices. Each connection creates an entry in the table. If the router's NAT table fills up, it can start struggling to track new connections. Some connections may not close cleanly, or the router may hold onto entries longer than necessary. Lower-end consumer routers sometimes have firmware that doesn't manage these states perfectly. So what does a reboot actually do? When you reboot your router, the NAT table is completely cleared. All existing connection states are removed, and the router starts tracking connections from scratch. In other words, memory is cleared, connection tracking resets, and the router's resources are freed up again. This is why rebooting can suddenly make things feel normal again. An important nuance to understand is this does not mean that NAT itself is broken. It just means the consumer routers are small computers with limited resources. Over long periods of uptime, connection tracking can accumulate states that slow things down. Another job your router performs is assigning IP addresses to the devices in your home network. This process is handled by something called DHCP, which stands for Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol. Without DHCP, every device would need a manually assigned IP address. That would be extremely inconvenient and prone to errors. So instead, when a device joins the network, it asks the router for an address. It basically says,
"Hey, does anyone have an IP address I can use?"
The router responds with an available address, something like 192.168.1.42. It also gives the device important information about the subnet mask, the default gateway, and the DNS server. That information is what allows the device to actually communicate on the network. When the router assigns an IP address, it doesn't give it permanently. It assigns it for a lease period. For example, it might lease this IP address to a laptop for 24 hours. The router keeps a DHCP lease table that tracks which devices have addresses. Over time, several things can go wrong. A device may leave the network without properly releasing the address. The router still thinks the address is in use. Two devices might accidentally try to use the same address. This can cause intermittent connectivity issues. On consumer routers, the DHCP service can occasionally hang or behave incorrectly due to firmware bugs or long uptime. When that happens, new devices may fail to obtain an address. So why does rebooting help? When the router restarts, the DHCP service restarts. The lease table is rebuilt. Stale entries disappear. Address conflicts may be resolved. So devices reconnect and request fresh addresses. That's why sometimes rebooting the router suddenly fixes devices that couldn't connect before. Another important thing to understand is that a home router is basically a small computer running specialized software. Most consumer routers run some form of embedded Linux or a similar operating system. That system is responsible for running several different services at once: packet routing, NAT translation, DHCP address assignment, firewall rules, Wi-Fi radio management, and DNS forwarding. Each of these functions is handled by software processes running inside the router. And like any software, these processes can sometimes behave badly over time. Some firmware processes slowly consume memory over time without releasing it properly. Since routers often have limited RAM, performance can degrade after a long uptime. A service like the Wi-Fi controller or DHCP daemon may occasionally stop responding correctly. When that happens, devices might lose connectivity or fail to connect properly. Routers constantly handle packets and maintain queues for network traffic. Under heavy load or due to firmware bugs, these queues can become inefficient or congested. So why does a reboot help? When you reboot the router, all running processes stop. Memory is cleared, services restart cleanly, connection tracking resets. Essentially, you're giving the router a fresh start, just like restarting your computer when it starts behaving strangely. Let's talk about when rebooting won't help. Restarting your router only affects the network inside your home. It can't fix problems outside your network. If the problem is with your internet provider, for example, an outage or congestion on their network, rebooting your router won't fix that. Another common issue is physical network problems. If an Ethernet cable is damaged, poorly crimped, or experiencing intermittent signal problems, restarting the router won't fix that. There are actually a few quick ways to diagnose physical network issues using built-in tools on your computer. I'll show you one of my favorite quick PowerShell checks for diagnosing that in another video. Another very common issue is the Wi-Fi environment. Sometimes the problem isn't the router at all. It's the wireless environment. Interference from neighboring networks, walls, or other electronics can degrade Wi-Fi performance. In those cases, restarting the router might appear to help temporarily, but the underlying issue is signal interference. In some cases, the problem isn't the router or the network, it's the device you're using. Phones, laptops, or smart devices can have their own networking issues, and restarting the router won't necessarily solve those. So when restarting your router fixes the problem, it's usually because it resets internal network state. Things like connection tracking, DHCP leases, or software processes. But if the issue is outside of the router, the restart might not make any difference. Understanding what your router is actually doing behind the scenes makes it much easier to know when a simple reboot will help and when it won't. As always, thank you for watching. And if you liked the video, consider giving it a thumbs up. And for more content like this, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next one.